Picture this. You wake up one morning, walk down to the river like you have every single day of your life, like your parents did, like your grandparents did, and it's gone. Not low, not muddy, gone. Just a cracked ribbon of dirt where a river used to be, baking under a sun that suddenly feels a lot more hostile than it did yesterday. No emergency broadcast, no bottled water delivery, no group chat where someone says, "Hey, does anyone know what's going on with the water?" Just you, your family, your goats if you're lucky enough to have goats, and a very large, very urgent question. Now what? This wasn't a one-time horror story. This happened over and over again across thousands of years of human history in almost every corner of the planet. Rivers vanished. Lakes shrank into memories. Rain just stopped showing up for work for decades at a time. And ancient humans, without a single hydrologist, satellite, or weather app between them, had to figure out how to survive it. Some societies read the signs and adapted brilliantly. Others ignored the warning signs, kept building temples instead of wells, and simply vanished from the map. Today we're digging into what actually happened when the water disappeared. The migrations, the engineering, the desperate prayers to increasingly annoyed-sounding gods, and the surprisingly clever tricks that let some people not just survive a drought, but thrive in it. Let's start somewhere green. Yes, green. Because roughly 10,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert, that sunburnt, sand-blasted, nothing lives here wasteland you're picturing right now, was not a desert at all. It was a savanna. Lakes, rivers, grasslands, hippos wallowing in mud, crocodiles sunning themselves on riverbanks that are now hundreds of miles from any water. Archaeologists call this period the African Humid Period. And honestly, it sounds like an incredible time to be alive if you were, say, a hippo real estate agent. Humans loved it there. Cave paintings found deep in what is now the middle of the Sahara show cattle herding, swimming, dancing, people living what looks like a pleasant pastoral life. Then, starting around 6,000 years ago, the rains began to retreat. Slowly at first, a dry season lasting a little longer than usual, a lake shrinking by a few feet a year. The kind of change you could easily convince yourself was temporary. It'll rain next year, except it didn't. Over the course of roughly 1,000 years, one of the most dramatic climate shifts in human history turned lush grassland into the largest hot desert on Earth. So what did people do? They didn't just stand there sunburned and confused. They moved. Slowly, generation by generation, populations pushed toward the one reliable water source left standing, the Nile. And this right here is one of the great underrated plot twists of ancient history. Egypt, one of the most iconic and enduring civilizations humanity has ever produced, exists largely because a climate catastrophe pushed a bunch of displaced herders toward a single river valley and forced them to get very, very good at cooperating, organizing labor, and managing water. The pyramids, in a very real sense, are a monument built by refugees from a drought. Nobody puts that on the postcard. But moving toward a river only works if there's a river to move toward. What happens when there isn't one? What happens when the drought hits the very heart of a civilization that has nowhere else to go? For that, we head to the Indus Valley, home to one of the largest and most sophisticated urban civilizations of the ancient world. A civilization so advanced they had standardized weights, covered drainage systems, and multi-story homes with what were essentially early flushing toilets, at a time when a lot of the rest of the world was still figuring out pottery. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were engineering marvels. Grid-patterned streets, sophisticated wells, massive public water tanks. These people took water seriously in a way that would make a modern city planner weep with joy. And yet, starting around 4,000 years ago, something changed. The monsoon patterns that these cities depended on for reliable seasonal rain began to shift eastward. Rivers that had sustained massive population centers, including one called the Ghaggar Hakra, which some researchers link to the legendary Sarasvati River mentioned in ancient texts, began to dry up or change course entirely. Here's the part that should unsettle you. The Indus Valley people didn't collapse in a dramatic fire and ash apocalypse. There's no evidence of invasion, no burned cities, no signs of war. What the evidence actually shows is something slower and, in a way, scarier. A gradual unraveling. Cities that once bustled with tens of thousands of people slowly emptied out. Trade networks that stretched all the way to Mesopotamia quietly went silent. Populations dispersed into smaller, scattered farming villages, spreading eastward toward the Ganges Plain, where rainfall was still reliable. The great urban experiment didn't explode. It just deflated, like a balloon nobody was paying attention to anymore. And honestly, there's something very human about that. Not every disaster looks like a disaster movie. Sometimes it's just people quietly deciding the city isn't worth staying in anymore, one family at a time, until one day there's nobody left to lock the gates. Speaking of civilizations that vanished with almost eerie quiet, let's talk about the Akkadian Empire, because this one has a plot twist that archaeologists are still arguing about at conferences. Around 4,300 years ago, the Akkadian Empire, often credited as the world's first empire, stitched together by a king named Sargon who apparently had zero chill and a lot of ambition, was thriving in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Agriculture was booming thanks to careful irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates. Then, within just a few decades, it collapsed. For a long time, historians assumed the usual suspects: war, rebellion, bad kings, palace drama, standard ancient collapse stuff. But then researchers started pulling sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman and found something that changed the story entirely: a massive spike in wind-blown dust dated to almost exactly the same time as the Akkadian collapse. This wasn't just a dry spell. This was an abrupt, severe, decades-long drought event now known as the 4.2 kilo-year event, and it appears to have hit the entire region, not just Mesopotamia, but Egypt, the Indus Valley, and parts of China as well, at nearly the same time. Some scientists think this drought was severe enough to have contributed to multiple ancient collapses across 3 different continents simultaneously. That is an almost unbelievably bad week for humanity, stretched out over generations. Ancient texts from the region seem to back this up in eerily specific detail. One inscription, often referred to by historians describing the era, laments fields that produced no grain, rivers that ran dry, and people abandoning their homes because there was simply nothing left to farm. Archaeological surveys of northern Mesopotamia show settlements that were densely populated one century and completely abandoned the next. Entire regions were depopulated as farmers fled south toward areas still fed by river irrigation, putting sudden, crushing pressure on resources that were already stretched thin. It's basically the Bronze Age version of an entire country's population trying to move into one already crowded city block. And it went about as smoothly as you'd expect, which is to say, not smoothly at all. Okay, so clearly moving toward rivers works great until the rivers themselves start failing, or until so many people show up that there isn't enough water to go around anyway. So what did smarter, more forward-thinking ancient engineers do instead? They built water infrastructure so ingenious that some of it is still functioning today, thousands of years later, quietly outperforming plenty of modern water systems. Enter the qanat. If you haven't heard of these, prepare to be mildly obsessed for the rest of the day. Qanats are underground tunnels, first developed in ancient Persia roughly 3,000 years ago, designed to tap into groundwater at the base of hills or mountains and carry it via gravity, through gently sloping tunnels sometimes stretching for dozens of miles, all the way to farms and towns in the arid lowlands. The genius part is that because the water travels underground, it doesn't evaporate in the brutal desert heat the way surface canals do. You're basically building an invisible river that the sun can't touch. Constructing one of these things was absolutely not for the faint of heart. Workers dug vertical shafts at intervals along the entire route, both to remove excavated dirt and to allow ventilation, then connected them underground with hand-dug tunnels, sometimes at depths of over 100 feet, using nothing but basic tools and what must have been an extraordinary tolerance for cramped, dark spaces. One wrong calculation on the slope, and you'd either flood the tunnel or end up with water that just sits there going nowhere. And centuries of laborers pulled this off with a level of precision that engineering students still study today. Some qanats built well over 2,000 years ago in Iran are still delivering water to communities right now in the present day, while plenty of pipes installed in the 20th century have already failed. Ancient technology quietly out-engineering modern infrastructure. Let that sink in for a second. The Nabateans, meanwhile, took a completely different approach and turned water management into borderline sorcery. If you've ever seen a photo of Petra, the stunning rose-colored city carved into cliff faces in modern-day Jordan, you were probably looking at the tombs and temples and thinking, wow, incredible architecture. Which fair. But the real genius of Petra is invisible, hidden underneath and behind all that stunning stonework. The Nabateans built an extensive network of channels, cisterns, and dams that captured and stored rainwater during the region's brief, unpredictable rainy season, then distributed it carefully throughout the dry months, essentially allowing a major city to flourish in the middle of a desert that received only a few inches of rain a year. They plastered channels to prevent water loss, built dams to control flash floods that could otherwise wipe out the entire settlement in minutes, and constructed cisterns capable of storing enough water to sustain thousands of people and their animals through months of bone-dry heat. This wasn't a lucky accident. This was centuries of careful hydraulic engineering by a civilization that understood something crucial. In the desert, water isn't just a resource, it's the entire foundation of political and economic power. Control the water, and you control everything. The Nabateans essentially became the ancient world's most successful water management consultants, and their fees were paid in becoming one of the wealthiest trading civilizations of their era. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Now let's hop continents, because drought didn't just threaten empires with rivers and rain patterns. It also threatened people who had built extraordinary lives in places that seemingly had almost no business supporting human settlement at all. The ancestral Puebloans, sometimes historically referred to by the somewhat controversial term Anasazi, built one of the most sophisticated societies in pre-contact North America in the Four Corners region. The high desert plateau, where modern-day Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. At a place called Chaco Canyon, they constructed massive multi-story stone buildings, some containing hundreds of rooms, aligned with remarkable astronomical precision in a landscape that gets maybe 9 inches of rain in an entire year. For comparison, that's less rain annually than some places get in a single rainy month. They pulled this off through an impressive combination of check dams, canals, and terraced farming designed to capture every possible drop of rain runoff and direct it toward crops. For a while, it worked spectacularly. Chaco Canyon became a major cultural and ceremonial hub, with trade goods flowing in from as far away as Mexico and the Pacific coast. Then, around the 1100s, tree ring data, and yes, scientists really can reconstruct ancient drought patterns just by studying the growth rings in old trees, which is one of the coolest research methods in archaeology, shows a series of severe, extended droughts hitting the region. Around the same time, populations at Chaco began declining, and eventually many ancestral Puebloan communities relocated to places like Mesa Verde, building the famous cliff dwellings tucked into canyon alcoves. Here's a detail that tends to surprise people. Those cliff dwellings likely weren't built primarily for defense, as popular imagination often assumes. Many researchers now believe the alcoves were chosen partly because they provided shelter, thermal insulation against extreme temperature swings, and crucially, proximity to seep springs, natural water sources trickling out of the canyon walls themselves. When your entire civilization revolves around finding and protecting reliable water, you build your home directly on top of the water source, cliffside views included at no extra charge. Eventually, even Mesa Verde was abandoned too, sometime in the late 1200s, during what tree ring researchers have identified as an even more severe, decades-long mega-drought. Entire communities that had thrived for generations packed up and migrated south, merging into what would eventually become the modern Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest. Their descendants are very much still around today, by the way. This isn't a story about a vanished mystery civilization, despite how tourist plaques sometimes phrase it. This is a story about incredibly resilient people who read the writing on the wall, or in this case, the rings in the trees, and moved before the drought could finish them off entirely. Speaking of mega droughts finishing civilizations off, we cannot talk about ancient water crises without addressing the Maya, because their story might be the single most studied and debated ancient drought collapse in the world. The classic Maya civilization, flourishing across what's now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras, built staggering cities featuring towering pyramid temples, sophisticated writing systems, and advanced astronomical calendars, all while living in a tropical region without any major permanent rivers or lakes near many of their biggest cities. So how do you support massive urban populations? Some cities held tens of thousands of people without reliable rivers. You build reservoirs, big ones. The city of Tikal, for example, had an incredibly sophisticated system of paved plazas, specifically angled and designed to channel rainwater. Runoff directly into massive plastered reservoirs capable of storing enough water to sustain the population through the dry season. For centuries, this worked beautifully, right up until it very much didn't. Beginning around the 800s, a series of increasingly severe droughts hit the Yucatan region, confirmed by researchers through a variety of methods including analyzing gypsum deposits in lake sediments, which can actually reveal how much a lake evaporated during specific periods in the past, which is wild that we can measure that at all. As the droughts intensified, one after another, city after city across the southern Maya lowlands began what archaeologists somewhat dramatically term the classic Maya collapse. Monument construction stopped, populations plummeted. Cities that had been continuously occupied and expanded for centuries were abandoned, sometimes seemingly in a hurry, with the jungle reclaiming them within a few generations. Now, to be clear, and this is important, drought almost certainly wasn't the only factor. Researchers point to warfare between rival city-states, deforestation from intensive agriculture, and political instability all compounding the crisis simultaneously. But the drought appears to have been the trigger that pulled everything else down with it, like knocking out the bottom block in a very tall, very elaborate Jenga tower built entirely out of limestone temples. And here's the detail that should give you chills. Researchers analyzing the timing have found that the most severe droughts coincided almost precisely with the periods of most dramatic population decline and city abandonment. When your entire food and water system depends on capturing rain that simply stops arriving in sufficient quantities for years at a stretch, even the most brilliant engineering in the world eventually runs out of tricks. And it's worth pointing out, the Maya people didn't disappear either, same as with the ancestral Puebloans. Millions of Maya descendants live across Central America today, still speaking Mayan languages, still practicing traditions with roots stretching back thousands of years. What collapsed wasn't a people. It was a specific, extremely water-dependent version of urban civilization that simply couldn't survive an extended, severe climate shift. Let's shift gears now, because so far we've mostly talked about big, dramatic civilizational collapses. But there's another entire category of human response to water scarcity that's honestly even more impressive in a quieter way. The people who never built massive cities at all, and instead developed such extraordinary water knowledge that they thrived, generation after generation, in some of the driest, most unforgiving environments on Earth. Take Aboriginal Australian. Communities living in the continent's vast desert interior, one of the driest inhabited regions on the planet, where some areas can go years between significant rainfall. Survival there required an almost encyclopedic mental map of water sources, passed down through oral tradition, song lines, and stories over tens of thousands of years. Aboriginal Australians have the longest continuous cultural history of any people on Earth, and a huge part of that longevity comes down to water knowledge that would make a modern hydrologist quietly hand in their resignation out of professional embarrassment. Communities knew exactly which tree species, like the desert bloodwood or certain eucalypts, stored water in their roots, and precisely how to extract it by digging up specific roots and draining them, sometimes yielding a genuinely useful amount of drinkable water from what looks to an untrained eye like a completely dry, dead-looking plant in the middle of nowhere. They tracked animal behavior obsessively, because animals like finches and pigeons need to drink daily, and will reveal the location of a hidden water hole if you simply watch where they fly at dawn and dusk. They knew which rock crevices and clay pans held water long after a rainfall had evaporated everywhere else, sometimes hidden under rock overhangs specifically to reduce evaporation. Essentially, natural cisterns that had been used and maintained by the same families for uncountable generations. This wasn't guesswork. It was a precise, tested, transmitted body of ecological knowledge, and it allowed continuous human habitation of some of the harshest desert on Earth for an almost incomprehensibly long stretch of time. A similar story unfolds with the San people, sometimes called Bushmen, in the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa. In a landscape with few permanent surface water sources, San communities developed an ingenious technique known as sip wells, locating spots where groundwater sits just a foot or two below dry, sandy riverbeds, digging down to reach it, then inserting a hollow reed or grass stem into the damp sand and sucking water up through it, sometimes filtering it through grass to keep sand out, and storing the extracted water in hollowed-out ostrich eggshells, which turn out to be nearly perfect natural water containers. Waterproof, durable, and easy to bury and cache in multiple locations across a territory for later use during travel. travel. Some sand communities also famously harvested moisture from sama melons, a wild desert melon that's mostly water, essentially eating their hydration when no other source was available. When your environment refuses to hand you water in any convenient form, you simply become extraordinarily creative about every single possible alternative, whether that's a plant, an eggshell, or a hollow reed stuck a foot into damp sand. Now, all this engineering and ecological genius is impressive, but let's be honest with ourselves for a second. Ancient humans weren't purely rational water engineers walking around calmly optimizing hydraulic systems all day. When the water disappeared and rational solutions ran out, people got desperate, and desperation in the ancient world very often turned toward religion. Nearly every ancient culture that depended on rainfall developed elaborate rain deities and rituals designed to plead with, bargain with, or occasionally outright bribe the forces controlling precipitation. In Mesopotamia, the storm god Adid was petitioned during droughts with specific prayers and offerings. In ancient China, rulers themselves were expected to perform rain-making rituals, and a prolonged severe drought was sometimes interpreted as a sign that the emperor himself had lost the mandate of heaven, which, if you think about it, is an incredibly high-stakes job review where your annual performance metric is literally whether or not it rains enough. In parts of ancient Mesoamerica, archaeologists have found evidence suggesting droughts sometimes coincided with increased ritual activity, including offerings made specifically at cave systems and cenotes, natural sinkholes considered sacred portals to the water-controlling underworld. Some of these rituals sound almost sweetly hopeful from our modern vantage point, and some sound genuinely disturbing. But viewed through the lens of the people actually living through these crises, none of it was superstition for its own sake. It was ancient humans doing the very human thing of trying to exert some sense of control, any sense of control at all, over a situation that was otherwise completely beyond their power to fix. When your crops are dying and your children are thirsty and there's absolutely nothing left to try, praying to a storm god suddenly makes a whole lot more emotional sense than it might from the comfort of a modern kitchen with a working tap 3 feet away. So what actually separated the civilizations that adapted and endured from the ones that collapsed? Looking across every single example we've covered, a pattern starts to emerge, and it's honestly a little uncomfortable in how relevant it still feels today. The societies that survived severe water crises tended to share a few key traits. They diversified their water sources instead of depending on just one river or one rainy season. They built redundancy and storage capacity well before a crisis hit, rather than scrambling for solutions once the reservoirs were already empty. They stayed flexible and were willing to migrate, relocate, or restructure their entire way of life when the environment demanded it, rather than stubbornly rebuilding the exact same system in the exact same spot. And crucially, they treated water knowledge as something precious to be actively taught, protected, and passed down, not left to chance. The societies that collapsed, on the other hand, tended to over-rely on a single, fragile system, whether that was one river, one reservoir, or one type of rain-fed agriculture. And they kept building bigger and more elaborate monuments right up until the moment the water simply stopped, seemingly unable or unwilling to adapt quickly enough once the environment changed beneath their feet. There's a genuinely sobering thought hiding in all of this. We tend to think of climate-driven water crises as a distinctly modern problem, something invented by the 20th century and industrial civilization. But ancient humans across wildly different continents and cultures with zero contact with one another faced remarkably similar crises again and again throughout history, and the solutions that worked were never really about having more advanced technology in some abstract sense. The Nabateans building cisterns in the desert, Persian engineers hand-digging qanats through solid rock, Aboriginal Australians memorizing water-bearing root systems across tens of thousands of years, sand communities sucking water through reeds buried in sand. None of that required an industrial economy. It required paying extremely close attention to the environment, planning generations ahead instead of just for next season, and being willing to change everything about how you lived the moment the evidence demanded it. Which, honestly, is a pretty useful thing to sit with the next time you turn on a tap without thinking twice about it. Somewhere back down the family tree of human history, someone was watching a finch at dawn, or digging a root out of bone-dry sand, or hand-carving a tunnel through solid rock in the pitch dark. Also, the people after them could have a little more water than they did. We're standing on top of thousands of years of exactly that kind of quiet, unglamorous genius, and most of us have never once had to think about it. If there's one thing this journey through history should leave you with, it's this. Water disappearing wasn't the end of the story for these ancient societies. It was the moment that forced their most extraordinary ingenuity to the surface. Some cultures rose to meet that moment and thrived for centuries longer because of it. Others didn't, and became the cautionary tales we're still studying and learning from today. Either way, the ground beneath your feet right now, wherever you're watching this from, has probably seen this exact story play out before, written in tree rings, sediment layers, and the bones of abandoned cities waiting patiently in the desert for someone to finally come along and ask what happened here.